This is the article of The Hindu from the editorial dated July 22. What can the world do to help Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka needs all its creditors to come together and give it some breathing space. On July 20, acting President Anil Wickramasinghe was elected the President of Sri Lanka. Yesterday we have seen that he won by 143 votes as compared to others they have not won even by 2 digits. So finally Anil Wickramasinghe was elected the President of Sri Lanka. Now the Government of India, which held an all-party meeting on the crisis in the island nation, said that the fiscal prudence and responsible government. Now these are two important terms which a question could be framed on that. What India could learn from Sri Lanka crisis. The next question regarding UPSC main would be, what should be India's aid policy to Sri Lanka? These two questions we shall dealt in detail in this article or through this article. Now we need to prepare a question for our upcoming mains. So fiscal prudence and responsible government. We have seen in the past year that the Rajapaksa government has proved to be inefficient regarding fiscal management. He has least knowledge in finance, plus he did not feel like to take the advice of experts during his tenure. Also, when the Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power, he promised to the citizen of Sri Lanka that he will cut down the tax, which he did. He maintained his promise, and he did after he got elected as a president of Sri Lanka. Now the cut down in the tax rate led to falling short of the revenue collection, which led to current account deficit and fiscal deficit. You don't have revenue, how would you pay to import prices? So that has actually led to the downfall of this government, because import price were more than that of export prices. These are the lessons to be learned from the situation in Sri Lanka, and that there should not be a culture of freebies. Now again, this is an important term. India promised to be supportive of Sri Lanka, which is struggling to deal with the devastation caused by the economic crisis. In such a scenario, what must the world and the India is particular do to help Sri Lanka and to help them to come out of this crisis? Now the first thing we need to understand this term culture of freebie, what we could learn from this. See the mistake that Rajapaksa government has done. They have actually, and mark my words, they have actually traded sustainability to security. They want to continue into the power. That means that they want to means the security of the government. Now they have traded sustainability to security. One thing we need to keep in mind, that the mistake that the Rajapaksa government has done is that they have traded sustainability to security. And you need to mark my words, that they traded sustainability to security. Security of being into the power throughout. for which they put on stake the sustainability of the economy. Right? Now, the ongoing approach of Anil Wickramasinghe should be that now he should reverse this trend. Like, first he should securitize what he have actually done. He has come into power. So first securitize, then salvate, then sustainability of the economy. So the major challenge of Wickramasinghe is first to give a stability, a political stability in the Sri Lanka, so that he could negotiate with the IMF to for the bailout, and he could negotiate to other creditors like IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and other nations from which they have taken loan. Because in order to settle down the crisis in the Sri Lanka, if any government is interested to help them, to whom they going to talk? Because earlier, before he came to power, this Wickramasinghe, there was no government. Now, if he acted as a president, and also we should know that Wickramasinghe has been prime minister for 6 times earlier. He is going to be president for the first time. So, first responsibility that he should perform is to give political stability. Secondly, he should fix monetary crisis within 6 months. 6 months are going to be very crucial for Sri Lanka. And also, this is going to be first and the last chance for Wickramasinghe to prove his leadership. Now next is, at the end of the civil war with the LDT, that was probably from 1984 to 2009, and in 2005 Mahendra Rajapaksa was the president. Sri Lanka had to go to IMF for support. Successive government can charge with economic mismanagement, physical as well as the budgetary. But you can implicate the Gotabaya Rajapaksa presidency with a lot of missteps that led to a country to where it is now, starving over the economic precepts. What you see now is a perfect storm: economic mismanagement over the years and political maleficence, which you can lay at the door of the Rajapaksa. Now we need to understand this physical and budgetary mismanagement. We have seen when the Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into government, he made few blunders and policy mismanagement. First, that he urged the people of Sri Lanka to go organic farming. Organic, because he actually want to reduce the budget which was used to spend in the import of pesticides, weedicides, insecticides. So he urged the people of Sri Lanka to go organic. Now, after this was implemented, it led to the food shortage by 50%. When they have the food shortage, they started importing the primary goods, which again led to burden on the more of import. Import became greater than export, which led to deficit. Secondly, the political maleficency, the main fallacies of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa could be: he was backed by the Singhals. Singhal, the Buddhist group, which comprises 70% of the population, and they are actually anti-minority. They are radical Buddhist, right-winged Singhal group, which had tried to streamline the Sri Lanka its diverse and coherent history of social relations. And also, this political fallacies has its role in the Chinese debt trap diplomacy. As we know that China has got Hanban Island on the east coast of Sri Lanka, southeast coast of Sri Lanka. Now this port has been given to China on 99 years of lease because Chinese have paid a huge loan to Sri Lanka, which Chinese knew that the Sri Lanka is not going to return back, and this has been lead to the Chinese debt trap diplomacy. Now the 10% of the debt of Sri Lanka accounts to China. Now the Chinese debt trap diplomacy also has its role in Sri Lankan crisis. Dr. Subba Rao has explained it very briefly. The cause of the physical crisis. Here he mentioned that an unsustainable current account deficit and unsustainable physical deficit, some of which Rajapaksa were not responsible for. Tourism collapse. How? Tourism collapse. What were the reason? Because Sri Lanka comprises that this tourism comprises of 10% of the GDP of the Sri Lanka. Tourism collapsed. Why? Because of after Easter bombing on the church, then came the pandemic, COVID, then the remittance that used to come from the migrants, these migrants which is diaspora declined because of the pandemic. Then again, because of the Ukraine war, we have seen that the prices of goods and especially crude oil have raised in the international market. Almost every country has been hit by it. Similarly, the prices of primary goods, primary commodities have rose up in this Ukraine war, which led to high import bill. Again, on the domestic front, he is saying that physical crisis is completely homemade, and that is true. And I have already explained in the above that Rajapaksa government gave into an unaffordable populism by cutting taxes. Now, I would like to mention that before Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into power in 2019, he came with a movement, and his party was not actually a kind of party, but he came as a platform, and his leadership was revolving around that platform. So no doubt he gained phenomenal populism when he came into power. We can say equivalent to that of Modi. And before election, he made promises that he would cut down taxes, and he kept his promise after the election. They cut the value added taxes by half. Look, huge amount of cut in the tax, eliminated capital gain good, made expenditure commitment on subsidies that they cannot afford. So debt ballooned. The Rajapaksa government was responsible for three specific things. One, unaffordable populism. This is the same factor as I have mentioned earlier in the video, that they traded sustainability to security. This Rajapaksa family actually want to be into the power. Two, erratic economic mismanagement. For example, the abrupt shift to organic farming, as I have already mentioned earlier in the video. And three, it did not go to IMF early enough. Now, what was the reason that they did not go to IMF early? See, if any country approaches IMF for loan, IMF always give loan with certain condition, and those conditions that they along with the loan they ask that they would restructure the economy in order to come out of the debt and in order to come out of the crisis, which at most of the time have been considered as an intervene. So this is the main cause why in the initial stage none of the country wants to approach to IMF, rather they would like to approach to their neighbor countries, and which the Sri Lanka did. Sri Lanka approached China rather than IMF in the beginning. Do you think global power could have moved in a sooner to try and help at least with the debt prepayment deferral rather than wait for the crisis to have reached the level it has? Now, a very good answer. A crisis like this requires IMF assistance and for other countries to come on board in support of the IMF program. Take for example bilateral debt that Sri Lanka owes to countries such as Japan, China and India. For these countries to reduce or restructure their debt, they will require an IMF program. As I have already mentioned that IMF give loan with the condition that they will restructure. I will explain this with an example in a moment. So what countries can do bilaterally is provide a bridge loan. Now again you have to keep this word in mind. I will explain in a short while, which is what India has done. But the structure solution has to come through IMF. Now first of all I will give you one example to understand this bridge loan, this restructure by IMF. What we need to understand with this statement is, let's take an example like you have a friend who has gone bankrupt. Bankrupt means he is unable to pay debt. For example, he has taken loan for his bike or car, then home loan, then education loan, or loan for any other perspective, for example marriage, sister's marriage, etc., etc. Now he has 4 to 5 kinds of loan which he is unable to pay through his salary. This person is A, through his salary. Now he approached to his friend B to help him out and helping him to come out of this crisis. Now this B friend is good in finance. For example, he is a CA and he has a money also. For example, this is Sri Lanka and this is India, and he has a money also. Now what this B friend will do, he will give loan to his friend A, which this friend A will use in repaying this loan that he has taken, and in return this friend B, who is good in finance, will assist this friend A in his finance management. This friend will keep a track on his income and expenditure. So this is what the bridge loan stands for. The loan that has been provided by friend B to friend A to solve all the debt that he is being into and also restructure the solution. So one country cannot restructure because it would term as a intervene in their economy. So that has to be done by any organization who has a credibility. So here that restructure has to be done by IMF and the loan has to be paid by any of his friends. Got it? Now the next is what precipitated the crisis was the big tax holiday that Mr. Rajapaksa have soon after he resumed office. The balance of payment suffered a great amount of pressure, as I have already mentioned that import was greater than that of export, which have led the disturbance in the balance of payment, especially on Sri Lanka's currency. They should have allowed the currency to depreciate, but they spent 5 billion to 6 billion of precious foreign exchange to keep the currency afloat. The advice by the governor of central bank was a mix of hubris and incompetence and unwillingness to go to IMF. The president knew nothing about the economy. They followed national economic policy. They kept borrowing from the commercial market. Now I will explain this national economic policy and what if they have allowed the currency to depreciate. Now we could see here that recently our central bank, that RBI, has done when the rupee tend to depreciate it, the RBI took a measure. They have intervened and they took a measure that they have swapped, we should say, swapped the dollar in exchange of rupee. So when the rupee has been swapped in return of dollar, this in turn appreciate the rupee. But what we are doing, we are actually spending our precious foreign exchange, which is dollar. So sometimes national banks do take these measures in order to control the depreciating currency. But it is advisable by the expert that sometimes the currency should let it allow to be get it depreciated. Every time central bank need not to take measures and intervene in the market. Secondly, they followed nationalist economic policy. See, when Rajapaksa clan, mind these words, Rajapaksa clan I am saying, came to power, the Sinhala Buddhists in Sri Lanka came to believe that their Masiha have arrived. I really don't know for what good reasons they were victimized for so long, because they are in majority. Now the leaders who have come to power think that they have emotive security shielded around them, because as we know they are in majority and they were backed by single groups. So livelihood imperatives as a normal democratic leader must recognize the accountability to material condition of the people. So this is what do we mean by the nationalist economic policy. Now this is again the crux of this article. The Indian government by itself. First read out the question. Let me read out the question. Do you think that India's assistance to Sri Lanka of about 3.8 billion was adequate and timely? How do you evaluate China's role, which own at least 10% of Sri Lanka debt? The Indian government by itself cannot solve Sri Lanka's problem. The Sri Lanka needs everybody who it owns debt to, the IMF, the World Bank and the ADB and all others partner, to come together and give it some breathing space. Now here it is important, the real scenario. See, if suppose a person is dying and the person is put on the ventilator and the person is dying out of some injury, though the first step what the doctor does is it provides oxygen, which we called here as breathing space. So the first thing, you the first step that you are required to put is to give a lifeline, because when there is no life, then there is no need of this surgical step. First, first and the foremost thing that we are required to do, we need to protect life with the help of supplying oxygen. So the need of the hour here is, first we need to give security. Security is of what? To the citizen, that they are falling short of. That's how India have stood up, and they have made a point. The very recently MEA in its bulletin have made a point that India have stood by the people of Sri Lanka, because the first and the foremost step is to provide security to the citizen of Sri Lanka, security of food, fuel, material things, material commodities. Then it has to be salvate. Sri Lankan now needs to come out of this crisis, then tending to sustainability in a long term. This is what we do mean by the breathing step. First, we need to provide security. Common people is in panic, they are paralyzing, they are starving, and there is no politician who have a credibility to stood by. This was India tried to provide. India could not have restructured all its loan or given all the money that Sri Lanka wanted. India gave aid on time and in insufficient quantity for Sri Lanka to give some breathing space in order to approach IMF and reach an arrangement with the IMF. Now here again China is playing a smart card, and they really don't want to make their hands dirty into this water of turbulence. Now they have very well mentioned, the writer has very well mentioned, what does Anil Wickremesinghe election involvement. Sri Lanka debt problem has two irrigant sins. One is over dependence on one country for a bilateral partner like China. The second is the sovereign borrowing in a foreign currency. Given that many of these loans went into infrastructure projects, as we have seen in Hanbanpota port, there is a special economic zone, there is a water treatment plant, there is a steel plant, there is a port, etc., etc., which this required infrastructure project that have taken too long or have been underutilized. Debt was piled up, but there are no revenue to repay. To that extent, China is responsible for loading on debt, irresponsible lending, and now responsible for not coming soon enough to Sri Lanka's aid. That's how we have seen that China is silent here. And on the other hand, India is providing aid unconditional. So they have turned out to be a real friend in need. India help has been unprecedented. Other countries have come up with very small amount of humanitarian assistance at the very most. You may argue that countries like Japan could do more, but if you see the record of the Rajapaksa government, it was very cavalier and churlish in its treatment of Japan over the last few years, because few of the investments Japan wanted to do, but Rajapaksa government have first agreed and later denied. And you see that Japanese are very sensitive. Only Indians knew how to deal with the Japanese. So they did not say anything in return, but they really mind it. So that's how they have made that now in the time of the need, Japan is not willing to come by cancelling project. See, I have made a point by cancelling project. Japan has every reason to be upset about the way relationship with Sri Lanka has developed over the last few years. Meanwhile, return of Chinese projects have not been added much value to the economy. The 99-year lease of Hambantota port was concluded without settling the loan owed to China, and now they are incurring recurring expenditures for running the port. So that they have been a white elephant. The Chinese want more control in Sri Lanka. They want free trade agreement, but Chinese goods already flooded the market. Now in this point they have keep on mentioning the fact is that if a country is under IMF program, external creditor become confident that they can go back into the country, and that's why I keep saying that Sri Lanka could have gone to the IMF sooner, or so that the confidence level would not have sunk. Now here one important point that experts have kept on been saying, that the Sri Lanka should have approached IMF. See, China have had a huge investment in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, China had been a strategic partner in Sri Lanka. Now here again, China did not want that Sri Lanka should approach to IMF, because when IMF comes into, they started restructuring. Now when restructure has done, then books get opened. There would be scrutiny. So China does not want that the profile on the basis of which the China have invested has been opened to the world. As we know that Chinese are very secretive, they don't allow their news to come out from China. So we could state that this could be one of the reasons as to why Sri Lanka did not approach IMF. Now again, there are several constraints that why Sri Lanka is unable to make proper agreement with the IMF. It is given here that Sri Lanka has not been able to reach a staff level agreement with the IMF. It has to legislate decisions on the taxation and revenue side, but it is not able to move in parliament on that front because of the political crisis. Even the fundamental assessment of the debt sustainability has not been reached with the IMF. So first of all, they need to have political stability in order to sort out the debt by restructuring with the IMF. Now second important thing what is worrying is that a fertile ground could be provided for extreme ideologies. Now here we need to understand the nature of the protest. Now here the protest is maybe called as classic, post modern, decentralized. See, the people have come on the street because of their actual grievances, and these are liberal common people. But we need to understand that this protest is a decentralized political activism. So when the protest is decentralized, then the protest has a tendency to be hijacked by any political party which has a significant presence on the ground and voice. So if a protest is not with a particular thought or with a particular ideology, and if it is not organized, then it could be hijacked by the opposition, or what we called here as extremist ideology. Now see, this article is very important. This interview is going to be very important because in a short content they have brought out the actual picture of the Sri Lankan crisis. Now what I was saying, that it could be backed by the main opposition, which is SJP, and according to the intelligence report, it is backed by SJP, JVP, and you will be surprised to know that there is a radical left element, which is university group. Actually, they are radical left-wing FSP, Frontline Socialist Party, who is a frontline militant group. And they are very trained, they are very organized, and they could protest the military. The capacity of the country to ensure its maritime security will also suffer, as there is a scenario of drug and arms smuggling staring us in the face. Now, India has to consider how far it can go to help Sri Lanka. We must remember that economic and security factors are interlinked. Maybe the thrust in India should be to look at more regionalizing factor when it comes to trade, and whether regionalization of Indian rupee can be of help to us and our neighbor. See, here we must remember economic and security factors. If there is a political instability in Sri Lanka, then naturally the tendency of the Tamilians that are residing in the eastern and the western border of Sri Lanka has a tendency to migrate towards Jaffna and entering into Tamil Nadu. In the concluding section, we could summarize this article as the important points that the new administration under President Wickramasinghe should be considered. I will detail out important points and you may write down, and it could be very helpful, and these points could be very helpful from the means perspective. The government should and must show serious about stabilizing the economy. By concluding talks with IMF, programs which will increase taxes and utility prices, which was missing in the earlier government, and utility prices to raise revenue. Now, raising revenue is very important, which was falling short in the earlier government, and increase interest rates to control inflation while preserving social welfare expenditures to protect the poor. Secondly, it has to implement structural reform to make the economy more open to trade and investment, and allow market forces to determine resource allocation. This means reducing barrier to trade, investment, cutting red tapeism, hampers business, privatization, loss-making state-owned enterprises such as Sri Lankan Airlines and Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. Then it has to build national consensus on implementing IMF program and reform by explaining that this is only solution to crisis. Now, third would be it has to restore the rule of law, which is very and the foremost important thing, and to enforce a strong anti-corruption policy, including asset declaration for all parliamentarian and a strong anti-corruption office supported by United Nations. Later, if it is possible, then executive presidency should be abolished. This is very hard to implement. The of government which was there is the root cause of the problem, should be abolished. Then it has to reset foreign policy towards a more neutral direction, away from pro-China political will and right set of policy. Sri Lanka stands a sporting chance of achieving some economic normalcy within next 3 years. India stands to gain by supporting Sri Lanka in its hour of need.